I don't know where you're watching from. Maybe you've waited tables in a bustling restaurant, hidden your dreams behind a smile, or grasped for a chance that seemed out of reach. Maybe tonight you're hoping the world will finally see you, not just as someone serving others, but as a person with a story worth knowing. It doesn't matter what time it is where you are, because today's story is about a moment that changed everything forever. The evening mist rolled off Lake Michigan, wrapping downtown Chicago in a silver veil that made the city lights blur like watercolors on wet canvas. 23 floors above the bustling streets, inside the glass-walled elegance of Azure, one of the city's most exclusive restaurants, the soft clink of crystal and the whispered conversations of the wealthy created a symphony of privilege that Maya Rodriguez had been listening to for 3 years. Maya moved between the mahogany tables with the practiced grace of someone who had learned to be invisible while being essential. At 42, she carried herself with quiet dignity, her dark hair pulled back in a simple bun that revealed the fine lines around her eyes, lines that spoke of late nights, early mornings, and the weight of responsibilities that never seemed to lighten. Her uniform was immaculate, pressed each morning in her small apartment on the South Side, but beneath the crisp white blouse and black slacks lived a woman whose dreams had been folded and tucked away like love letters from a younger self. The restaurant's interior was a study in understated luxury. Warm amber light spilled from crystal chandeliers, casting golden shadows across walls adorned with original paintings worth more than Maya would earn in 5 years. The scent of saffron and truffle oil wafted from the kitchen, mingling with the subtle perfume of wealth, that intangible aroma of money that seemed to permeate everything from the Italian leather chairs to the imported orchids that graced each table. Maya's section tonight included Table 12, a corner booth with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a commanding view of the Chicago River. It was there that Charles Montgomery sat alone, as he had every Tuesday evening for the past 6 months. A man in his early 50s, Charles possessed the kind of quiet authority that came not from loud gestures, but from the knowledge that his decisions could reshape entire markets. His net worth, whispered about in the financial districts and penthouse parties, hovered somewhere in the hundreds of millions. A fortune built on real estate investments, technology startups, and a prescient move into cryptocurrency that had multiplied his wealth exponentially. Tonight, Charles looked particularly tired. The sleeve of his custom-tailored Armani suit bore a barely visible wrinkle, and his usually perfect silver hair showed the aftermath of a long day of board meetings and merger negotiations. He stared out at the city lights with the hollow expression of a man who had everything money could buy, but had forgotten what he was trying to purchase. Maya approached his table with the gentle confidence that had served her well in this world of titans and their egos. She had learned to read the subtle signs, the way Charles's shoulders tensed when he was stressed about a deal, how his fingers drummed against the table when news from overseas markets was particularly volatile. Tonight, she noticed something different in his posture, a vulnerability that seemed to crack through his usual armor of success. "Good evening, Mr. Montgomery," Maya said softly, her voice carrying the warm cadence of her Mexican heritage, though tempered by years of serving Chicago's elite. "The usual tonight?" Charles looked up, and for a moment their eyes met. In that brief connection, Maya saw something she recognized, the exhaustion of someone carrying burdens alone, the weariness that money couldn't cure. It was a feeling she knew intimately, though her struggles were measured in unpaid bills rather than market fluctuations. "Yes, thank you, Maya," he replied, and the fact that he remembered her name after all these months still surprised her. Most of the wealthy patrons treated the staff like moving furniture, their eyes sliding past the servers as if they were merely extensions of the silverware. As Maya turned to leave, Charles called softly, "Maya?" She paused, turning back with raised eyebrows. "Thank you," he added simply, "for always being present." The words hung in the air between them, heavier than they appeared. Maya felt something shift in her chest, a recognition of shared loneliness that transcended the vast economic gulf between them. She nodded with a gentle smile that reached her eyes, then walked away, unaware that this simple moment of human connection would soon cascade into consequences neither of them could imagine. The kitchen buzzed with its usual controlled chaos. Steam rose from industrial-sized pots while chefs called out orders in a mixture of English and Spanish that created its own rhythm. Maya moved through the familiar dance, balancing plates with the muscle memory of someone who had been doing this work since she was 19. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the weight of her life seemed to press down harder than usual. 3 years ago, Maya had arrived in Chicago with her 15-year-old son Diego and a suitcase full of hope. She had left everything behind in Tucson after her husband's death in a construction accident. A man whose life insurance policy barely covered the funeral expenses and left Maya with a teenage son who looked at her with eyes that held too much understanding for someone so young. Chicago had promised opportunity, a chance to rebuild in a city where dreams were supposed to rise as tall as the skyscrapers. The reality had been harsher than the promise. Maya's days began at 5 in the morning, when she would prepare Diego's breakfast and lunch, check his homework from the night before, and make sure his school uniform was clean. Then came the hour-long commute on the CTA, standing in crowded train cars that smelled of coffee and resignation, watching the city wake up through scratched windows while she mentally prepared herself for another day of smiling at people who barely saw her. At Azure, Maya had carved out a niche for herself through pure determination and grace under pressure. She learned the wine list by studying library books about vintages and regions. She memorized the preferences of regular customers, remembering their allergies, their favorite tables, their personal dramas that they shared over expensive dinners. She became indispensable not through ambition, but through the simple act of caring about her work, even when that work felt like a beautiful prison. The money was better than anything she could find elsewhere. The wealthy tipped well when they were pleased, and Maya had learned the delicate art of being helpful without being intrusive, present without being presumptuous. On good nights, she could make $300 in tips. On exceptional nights, when a business deal was celebrated or an anniversary honored with champagne that cost more than her monthly rent, she might earn $500. But even the good nights came with a price. The ache in her feet from 12-hour shifts, the exhaustion that settled into her bones, the constant performance of gratitude for treatment that sometimes bordered on contempt. Diego was now 18 and a senior at Lincoln Park High School, a smart boy who had inherited his father's mechanical aptitude and his mother's quiet strength. He worked part-time at an auto shop after school, and together, their combined incomes allowed them to rent a small 2-bedroom apartment in Pilsen, where the sounds of the neighborhood, children playing, music drifting from open windows, the call of vendors selling elote and tamales, reminded Maya of home. But lately, Diego had been talking about college, about engineering programs and scholarships, about dreams that required money Maya didn't have. She had not told him about the acceptance letter from Northwestern that had arrived 2 weeks ago, or about the financial aid package that covered tuition, but left them facing thousands in additional costs. She had not mentioned the second job she had been considering, cleaning offices at night after her shifts at Azure ended, or the way her savings account balance made her stomach clench each time she checked it. As Maya carried Charles's order, a simple grilled salmon with vegetables, no sauce, and a glass of wine that cost more than most people's car payments, she found herself wondering what it would be like to live without the constant mathematics of survival, to buy groceries without calculating each item's cost, to fix a broken appliance without weighing it against next month's rent, to dream about the future without fear colonizing every hope. She set the plate down with practiced elegance, her movements economic and graceful. Charles looked up from his phone, where Maya caught a glimpse of numbers that seemed to have more zeros than should be mathematically possible. Bitcoin values, stock prices, investment portfolios that fluctuated by amounts that represented entire years of her labor. "Thank you," Charles said again, and Maya noticed that his voice carried a weight she hadn't heard before. "Maya." May I ask you something? The question caught her off guard. In 3 years of serving his table, their conversations had never extended beyond the transactional. Of course, Mr. Montgomery. Do you have children? Maya hesitated, unsure of the boundary being crossed. A son. He's 18. College-bound? The question hit closer to her current anxiety than she was comfortable with. We hope so, she replied carefully. Charles nodded, studying her face with an intensity that made Maya suddenly self-conscious. She could feel other customers' impatience, the subtle pressure of tables that needed attention, but something in Charles's expression held her there. Excellence should be rewarded, he said quietly, in all its forms. Maya felt a flush rise in her cheeks, uncertain whether she was being complimented or somehow tested. Thank you, sir, she managed, then excused herself to attend to other tables, leaving Charles alone with his expensive wine and whatever thoughts were casting shadows across his weathered face. But Tuesday evenings were about to become much more complicated than either of them anticipated. The first sign of trouble arrived on a Thursday evening, 2 weeks after Maya's brief conversation with Charles about Diego's college prospects. The restaurant was particularly busy, filled with the kind of power brokers and social climbers who treated Azure as their personal stage for displaying wealth and influence. Maya was managing 6 tables in her section, each demanding the kind of attentive service that required juggling multiple conversations, dietary restrictions, wine pairings, and the delicate egos of people accustomed to having their every whim anticipated. At table 8 sat Jennifer Wardwell, a woman in her mid-40s whose husband had recently sold his tech company for an amount that had been reported in the Chicago Tribune's business section. Jennifer was the type of customer who tested a server's professional limits, demanding elaborate modifications to menu items, sending back wine that was perfectly fine, and treating any minor delay as a personal affront. Her blonde hair was pulled back in the kind of expensive style that looked effortless, but required weekly appointments that cost more than Maya's monthly grocery budget. Excuse me, Jennifer's voice cut across the dining room, sharp enough to make conversations at neighboring tables pause. Excuse me, Maya hurried over, her heart beginning the familiar acceleration that accompanied difficult customer interactions. Yes, Mrs. Wardwell, how can I help you? This salmon is completely unacceptable. Jennifer's fork pointed accusingly at the barely touched entree. It's dry, it's overcooked, and frankly, for what we're paying here, this is insulting. Maya looked at the plate. The salmon appeared perfectly prepared, its surface glistening with the herb butter the chef was famous for. But she had learned long ago that arguing with customers, especially wealthy ones, was a luxury she couldn't afford. I'm so sorry, Mrs. Wardwell. Let me have the kitchen prepare a new one immediately. No. Jennifer's voice rose, ensuring that half the restaurant could hear her displeasure. I don't want another plate of this overpriced disappointment. What I want is to know how a place with this reputation can serve food that wouldn't be acceptable at a chain restaurant. The room had gone noticeably quiet. Maya felt the familiar burn of public humiliation, the spotlight of unwanted attention that made her wish she could disappear into the elegant carpet beneath her feet. She maintained her professional smile, though she could feel it growing strained around the edges. I understand your disappointment, Mrs. Wardwell. Of course, we won't charge you for the salmon, and perhaps I could recommend— Don't you dare try to recommend anything to me. Jennifer's eyes blazed with the particular fury of someone who had never been told no and rarely faced consequences for her behavior. You people think you can just smile and apologize and everything will be fine. Well, I've had enough of incompetent service from incompetent people. The words, you people, hung in the air like a slap. Maya felt the familiar sting of casual racism disguised as customer service complaints, the reduction of her dignity to a stereotype that some wealthy patrons carried like a weapon. Around the dining room, some guests looked uncomfortable, while others seemed to enjoy the entertainment of watching someone being publicly dressed down. From the corner booth, Charles Montgomery watched the scene unfold with growing discomfort. He had spent the past several weeks observing Maya's professionalism, her grace under pressure, the way she dealt with difficult customers while maintaining her dignity. Tonight, he was seeing the other side of the equation, the entitlement and casual cruelty that wealth sometimes fostered in people who confused financial success with moral superiority. "Mrs. Wardwell," Maya said quietly, her voice steady despite the humiliation burning in her chest. "I sincerely apologize for your disappointing experience. Let me speak with my manager about how we can make this right." But Jennifer wasn't finished. "You know what the problem is? This entire place has gone downhill. They're hiring anyone off the street and it shows. When you're paying premium prices, you expect premium service from people who understand what that means." The implications were clear, and Maya felt them hit like physical blows. In the corner of her eye, she saw other staff members watching, some with sympathy, others with relief that they weren't the ones under attack. The maitre d' was approaching, but slowly, with the reluctance of someone hoping the situation would resolve itself. "I understand you're upset," Maya replied, her voice growing quieter rather than louder, a technique she had learned for de-escalating situations while preserving what remained of her dignity. Perhaps nothing." Jennifer stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor with a sound that made everyone in the vicinity wince. "I want to speak to your manager immediately, and I want to know what you intend to do about staff who clearly can't handle the caliber of clientele this restaurant attracts." The maitre d', Robert Chen, finally reached the table. A smooth man in his 50s who had built his career on managing exactly these kinds of situations, Robert possessed the diplomatic skills necessary to satisfy angry customers while protecting his staff. But Robert also understood the economic realities of running an exclusive restaurant. Wealthy customers who caused scenes were still wealthy customers, while servers could be replaced. "Mrs. Wardwell, I'm Robert Chen, the maitre d'. I understand there's been some concern about your dining experience tonight." Jennifer launched into a detailed complaint that grew more elaborate with each sentence, describing service failures that seemed to expand beyond the boundaries of reality. Maya stood silently beside the table, her professional mask firmly in place, while inside, she felt the familiar erosion of self-worth that came from being used as a scapegoat for someone else's dissatisfaction with life. As Jennifer spoke, Maya noticed Charles watching from his corner table. His expression was unreadable, but something in his posture suggested he was paying closer attention to the scene than the other diners who were trying to pretend they weren't listening. "Of course, Mrs. Wardwell," Robert said smoothly when Jennifer finished her monologue. "We take all customer feedback very seriously. Maya is actually one of our most experienced servers, but clearly tonight hasn't met your expectations. Let me personally ensure that your entire table's meals are complimentary, and perhaps we could arrange for you to try our new tasting menu on your next visit." It was a generous offer, the kind of compensation that usually mollified even the most difficult customers. But Jennifer seemed energized by the attention and the power she felt in this moment of unchallenged authority. "That's a start," she said, her voice carrying across the dining room. "But what I really want to know is what you're going to do about the service problem. Because if this is the standard your servers maintain, maybe I need to reconsider whether Azure is the right place for the charity event I'm planning." The implicit threat was clear. Jennifer's charity connections represented potential business worth tens of thousands of dollars. Maya understood the mathematics of her situation. Her job security was being weighed against the restaurant's need to maintain relationships with wealthy patrons who could influence Azure's reputation in Chicago's elite social circles. Robert's smile grew tighter, more calculating. "Mrs. Wardwell, I assure you that we will address this situation appropriately. Maya, perhaps you could give Mrs. Wardwell and myself a moment to discuss how we can ensure her future experiences exceed her expectations." It was a dismissal, couched in diplomatic language but unmistakable in its intent. Maya nodded, feeling the eyes of the entire dining room following her as she walked away from the table, her dignity intact but fragile, like glass that had been struck but not yet shattered. As she busied herself with other tables, Maya could hear fragments of the continued conversation between Robert and Jennifer, the discussion of service standards and appropriate staff training that she knew was really about whether she would still have a job tomorrow. The familiar anxiety of economic insecurity settled over her like a weighted blanket, heavy and suffocating. From his corner table, Charles Montgomery had witnessed the entire exchange, and something about Maya's quiet dignity in the face of such public humiliation had awakened something in him he thought had died with his wife 3 years ago. The injustice of the scene, the casual cruelty disguised as customer service standards, the way Maya had maintained her professionalism while being systematically dehumanized, it reminded him of why he had stopped believing in the inherent goodness of his own social class. But Charles Montgomery was about to discover that sometimes the most profound moments of clarity come not from great revelations, but from small acts of unexpected kindness, and that the woman serving his Tuesday evening salmon was harboring depths of character that would challenge everything he thought he knew about worth, dignity, and what it meant to serve others. The evening's humiliation was just the beginning of a chain of events that would transform both Maya's and Charles's understanding of what happens when two people from different worlds recognize their shared humanity in the space between power and powerlessness. What happened next would test every assumption Maya had about her place in the world and force Charles to confront the man he had become in the years since grief had frozen his heart into something that resembled success but felt like a beautifully appointed tomb. The breaking point came 3 days later, on a Sunday evening when the restaurant was quieter, filled with couples celebrating anniversaries and families marking achievements with expensive meals that would become cherished memories. Maya had survived Jennifer Wardwell's complaint with her job intact, but barely. Robert had made it clear that she was on notice, a phrase that meant one more customer complaint could end her 3-year tenure at Azure. The anxiety had settled into her bones, the kind of constant low-level stress that made sleep elusive and turned every interaction with customers into a potential minefield. Diego had noticed her distraction, asking twice if she was feeling well, but Maya had perfected the art of carrying her burdens invisibly. Her son was weeks away from graduation, and his acceptance to Northwestern felt both like a miracle and an impossibility given their financial situation. Charles Montgomery sat at his usual table, but tonight he wasn't alone. Across from him sat his business partner, Marcus Webb, a man whose aggressive investment strategies had helped them build their cryptocurrency portfolio into a fortune that fluctuated by millions daily. Marcus represented everything Charles had once found admirable about ruthless success: the complete compartmentalization of emotion and profit, the ability to make decisions based purely on numbers rather than sentiment. The Jakarta deal should close next week, Marcus was saying, scrolling through projected returns on his tablet. Conservative estimates put our profit margin at 47 million, but if the Bitcoin exchange maintains its current trajectory, we could see returns exceeding 60 million by year's end. Charles nodded, but his attention kept drifting to Maya as she moved through the dining room. Tonight she seemed more fragile than usual, her professional composure requiring visible effort to maintain. He had noticed the way Robert watched her, the hypervigilance of someone whose job security was hanging by a thread. "Charles, are you listening?" Marcus's voice cut through his wandering attention. "Sorry, you were saying?" "The Jakarta deal. 47 million minimum, potentially 60 with favorable exchange rates. We need to move the funds through the Cayman subsidiary by Friday to optimize the tax implications." The numbers that once would have commanded Charles's complete attention now felt abstract, like statistics from someone else's life. Somewhere in the past month, watching Maya navigate the delicate ecosystem of service and entitlement, Charles had begun to feel the weight of wealth differently. The millions in his portfolio seemed less like achievements and more like barriers between him and the kind of authentic human connection he witnessed in Maya's daily interactions with customers who often treated her as invisible. "Marcus," Charles said quietly, "do you ever think about the people who make our lifestyle possible? Marcus looked up from his tablet with the expression of someone who had been asked to consider an irrelevant philosophical question during a business meeting. What do you mean? The staff here, the servers, the kitchen workers, the people who make it possible for us to sit here discussing $47 million deals over dinner. Marcus glanced around the dining room with disinterest. They're doing their jobs, Charles. We're paying for a service. That's how the economy works. It was the same attitude Charles had carried for most of his adult life, the comfortable distance that wealth created between the served and the servers. But something had shifted in his perspective, a crack in the comfortable certainty that money could insulate him from the moral complexities of inequality. Maya approached their table with the professional grace that had become second nature, but Charles noticed the extra effort it was taking tonight, the way her smile required a moment to compose itself. Good evening, Mr. Montgomery, Mr. Webb. Can I start you with something to drink tonight? Marcus barely looked up from his tablet. Macallan 18, neat. And bring us the wine list for something decent with dinner. Charles felt embarrassed by his partner's dismissive tone. The casual rudeness that wealth sometimes bred in people who confused financial success with personal superiority. Thank you, Maya. I'll have the usual, and please, take your time with the wine selection. Maya nodded gratefully, the small kindness of being treated like a person rather than a service mechanism visibly affecting her composure. As she walked away, Charles found himself watching her interaction with other tables, noticing the way she remembered the regular customers' preferences, how she anticipated needs without being intrusive, the gentle dignity with which she handled even the most demanding requests. Christ, Charles, you're staring at the help like you've never seen a waitress before, Marcus said with a laugh that carried no warmth. You know, if you're feeling lonely, there are better ways to address that than getting sentimental about the service staff. The comment hit Charles with unexpected force, not because it was particularly cruel, but because it reflected the callousness he recognized in his own past behavior. How many times had he sat in restaurants like this one, discussing deals worth more money than the servers would earn in their lifetimes, without ever considering their humanity beyond their function? She's been serving us for months, Marcus. Her name is Maya. She has a son who's about to graduate high school. Marcus shrugged. Good for her. Charles, I need you to focus here. We've got decisions to make that affect investors across 3 continents. The human interest stories can wait. Maya returned with their drinks, her professional mask firmly in place, but Charles could see the effort it required. As she set down Marcus's whiskey, he spoke without looking up from his tablet. This glass has water spots. Can you bring me a clean one? Charles examined the glass, which appeared perfectly clean to him. Maya's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but she nodded graciously. Of course, sir. Right away. As Maya walked back toward the bar, Charles felt something crystallize in his chest, a recognition of the casual humiliation that wealth could inflict simply through the exercise of entitlement. The glass wasn't dirty. Marcus was simply exerting power because he could, because he knew Maya couldn't respond without risking her job. That was unnecessary, Charles said quietly. What was unnecessary? The glass was fine. You know it, and she knows it. Marcus finally looked up from his tablet, studying Charles with the attention he usually reserved for market fluctuations. Charles, are you having some kind of midlife crisis? Because if so, there are therapists who specialize in helping wealthy men work through their guilt about success. But Charles wasn't listening. He was watching Maya at the bar, speaking quietly with the bartender, maintaining her professionalism while dealing with yet another small humiliation in what he was beginning to understand was a daily series of such moments. The weight of his own complicity in this system, the way his wealth had insulated him from considering the human cost of the luxury he took for granted, settled over him like a revelation that was equal parts enlightening and shameful. Maya returned with a fresh glass, setting it down with the same gracious efficiency she brought to every interaction. Marcus accepted it without acknowledgement, as if clean glasses materialized through his will rather than through the labor of people he refused to see as fully human. Thank you, Maya, Charles said, and something in his tone made her look at him more directly than usual. In that moment of eye contact, he saw something that made his chest tighten. The exhaustion of someone who had spent years making herself invisible in order to do her job. The dignity of someone who refused to let mistreatment define her worth, and beneath it all, a kind of quiet strength that made his own wealth seem trivial by comparison. As the evening progressed and Marcus continued discussing offshore accounts and cryptocurrency exchanges, Charles found himself thinking about different kinds of value, the worth of work that couldn't be measured in stock portfolios, the dignity of service that created space for others to celebrate their achievements, the quiet heroism of people who maintain their humanity in environments designed to reduce them to their function. By the end of dinner, as Maya cleared their plates with the same professional grace she had shown at the beginning of the evening, despite Marcus's continued dismissiveness, Charles had made a decision that would surprise everyone, including himself. It was a decision born not from guilt or charity, but from recognition, the acknowledgement of worth that had been invisible to him until he had learned to see past the barriers that wealth and privilege created. What Charles was about to do would transform Maya's life, but more importantly, it would begin his own journey back to the kind of person his late wife had fallen in love with, before grief and money had built walls around his heart that made genuine connection feel like a luxury he couldn't afford. The transformation was about to begin with a simple act that would ripple through both their lives in ways neither could have anticipated, proving that sometimes the most profound changes come not from grand gestures, but from the quiet recognition of shared humanity across the artificial boundaries that society constructs between those who serve and those who are served. 2 weeks after the evening with Marcus, Maya arrived at work to find Robert Chen waiting for her in the staff break room, his expression carrying the kind of professional gravity that made her stomach clench before he even spoke. The break room smelled of industrial coffee and anxiety, fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across the worn linoleum floor where countless servers had received news that would alter their lives. "Maya, please sit down." Robert's tone was carefully neutral, but Maya had worked in restaurants long enough to recognize the cadence of termination conversations. "We need to discuss your employment status." Maya's hands found the back of a plastic chair, her knuckles white against the cheap metal frame. 3 years of exemplary service, countless late shifts, holiday work when other staff called in sick, perfect attendance despite Diego's occasional emergencies. All of it felt suddenly fragile, balanced on the edge of someone else's whim. "There's been another complaint," Robert continued, consulting a folder that seemed too thin to contain the destruction of someone's livelihood. "Mrs. Patterson from last Tuesday evening. She felt your service was inadequate." Maya remembered Mrs. Patterson clearly. A woman who had sent back 3 different appetizers, demanded that the kitchen prepare her salmon without any seasoning, then complained that it was bland, and left a 5% tip while loudly proclaiming that the service didn't deserve more. Maya had remained professional throughout the difficult interaction, but apparently professionalism wasn't sufficient protection against the arbitrary nature of customer dissatisfaction. "I followed all proper protocols, Robert. I documented the interaction according to restaurant policy." "I know you did, Maya, but we've discussed this before. After the Wardwell incident, we can't afford another complaint, especially from someone with Mrs. Patterson's social connections. She's threatening to post negative reviews on social media, and she's mentioned your name specifically." The mathematics of Maya's situation crystallized with brutal clarity. Her job security was being measured against the restaurant's reputation among wealthy patrons who could damage Azure's standing with a few strategic comments at charity galas and country club lunches. She was expendable in a way that social media influence was not. "I understand the restaurant's position," Maya said carefully, "but I've worked here for 3 years without incident until recently. These complaints aren't about my service quality. They're about customers who use servers as targets for frustrations that have nothing to do with their dining experience." Robert's expression softened slightly, revealing the discomfort of someone forced to make decisions that conflicted with his personal sense of fairness. "Maya, you're a good server. One of our best, actually. But Azure's success depends on maintaining relationships with clients who generate significant revenue. Mrs. Patterson alone spends $30,000 a year here, and her recommendations have brought in at least 6 other high-value customers." The number hit Maya like a physical blow. $30,000, more than half of her annual income, represented what one customer spent on meals while she struggled to save enough for Diego's college expenses. The disparity felt obscene, but more than that, it illuminated the impossible mathematics of her situation. She could be perfect at her job and still lose it, because perfection wasn't measured by competence, but by the satisfaction of people who viewed her as an extension of the glassware. "What exactly are you telling me, Robert?" "I'm telling you that effective tomorrow, we'll need to make a change. HR will have your final paycheck ready this afternoon, including compensation for unused vacation days. I've also prepared a letter of recommendation that highlights your strengths. You're skilled enough to find another position quickly." The words tumbled around Maya's consciousness like dice in a cup, each one significant, but the final result devastating. Tomorrow. After 3 years of perfect attendance, of learning wine pairings and memorizing dietary restrictions, of enduring casual racism and sexual comments with professional grace, of building relationships with regular customers who trusted her recommendations, all of it reduced to a severance check and a letter of recommendation. "I have a son about to graduate high school, Robert. He's been accepted to Northwestern. This job was how I was planning to afford his college expenses." The personal information spilled out before Maya could stop it, a violation of the professional distance she had maintained for 3 years. But facing the destruction of her financial future, the careful barriers between her private struggles and her work persona crumbled like tissue paper in rain. Robert looked genuinely uncomfortable now, the weight of the human consequences of his business decision visible in the way his shoulders sagged. "Maya, I'm truly sorry. If there was another way, but the owners have made their position clear. Customer satisfaction has to be our priority, even when the customers are difficult." Maya stood slowly, her legs feeling uncertain beneath her. The break room that had been a refuge during countless shifts now felt like a courtroom where she had been tried and convicted for the crime of being human in an environment that demanded invisibility. "I'll clean out my locker and finish my shift today." "You don't have to work today, Maya. We can handle—" "I'll finish my shift," Maya repeated, her voice carrying a quiet firmness that surprised them both. "I've never left a shift incomplete, and I won't start today." As Maya walked through the restaurant toward her locker, she felt the familiar weight of the place differently. The gleaming surfaces and expensive artwork that had once represented aspiration now felt like monuments to a system that valued wealth over humanity. The soft conversations and clinking silverware sounded like the soundtrack to her own irrelevance. Her locker contained 3 years of accumulated life: a spare uniform, comfortable shoes for double shifts, photos of Diego at various school events, a small Spanish-English dictionary she had used to help customers who spoke her first language, and a thank you card from an elderly regular customer who had passed away the previous year. As Maya packed these fragments of her working life into a small cardboard box, she thought about Diego waiting at home, probably doing homework at their kitchen table, unaware that his college dreams had just become exponentially more complicated. She thought about the month of rent she had in savings, the job applications she would have to start submitting tomorrow, the explanations she would need to craft for why she was suddenly available for immediate employment. But beneath the anxiety and disappointment, Maya felt something else stirring, a quiet anger at the injustice of a system that allowed her to be discarded for the convenience of customers who treated her humanity as negotiable. For 3 years, she had absorbed their casual cruelties, their entitlement, their assumption that her dignity was part of the service they were purchasing. She had smiled through casual racism, sexual comments, and the constant implication that her worth could be measured by their satisfaction. The final irony was that Maya was an exceptional server precisely because she treated her job as more than just work. She remembered customers' preferences, anticipated their needs, created an atmosphere of warmth and professionalism that enhanced their dining experience. She had pride in her work, took satisfaction in doing it well, and had built relationships with regular customers who appreciated her attention to detail. None of that mattered now. What mattered was the arbitrary dissatisfaction of two wealthy women who had found in Maya a convenient target for their own unhappiness with life. What mattered was a social media threat and the economic calculations of a business that had to choose between justice and profit. As Maya closed her locker for the final time, she felt the strange liberation that sometimes accompanies loss. The constant anxiety of trying to satisfy unsatisfiable customers was gone. The hypervigilance required to navigate the racial and class dynamics of serving Chicago's elite was no longer necessary. She was unemployed, financially vulnerable, and facing an uncertain future, but she was also free from the daily humiliation of pretending that abuse was acceptable as long as it wore expensive clothes and left adequate tips. Maya straightened her uniform one final time and walked back into the dining room to complete her last shift at Azure, unaware that in the corner booth where Charles Montgomery sat alone, reading the financial section and occasionally glancing around the restaurant with increasing interest. The seeds of an unexpected alliance were already beginning to germinate. Charles had been watching the subtle changes in the restaurant's atmosphere, the way staff members moved differently when certain customers were present, the invisible tension that surrounded interactions between servers and the more difficult patrons. Tonight, he would witness Maya's final shift and the quiet dignity with which she served customers who didn't know they were being attended to by someone whose professional life was ending with their indifference. What Charles was about to learn would challenge everything he thought he understood about worth, justice, and the true cost of the luxury he had taken for granted all his life. The silence that followed Maya's departure from Azure felt heavier than anyone expected. 3 days after her final shift, the restaurant operated with the mechanical efficiency that money could purchase, but something essential had been lost. The warmth that comes from genuine care, the attention to detail that stems from pride in one's work rather than mere obligation. Charles Montgomery sat in his usual corner booth on the first Tuesday evening after Maya's termination, studying the replacement server with the same attention he might give to a quarterly financial report. The young man was competent enough. He knew the wine list, took orders accurately, and maintained the professional demeanor that Azure demanded. But there was something missing, an indefinable quality that Charles hadn't fully appreciated until it was gone. "Will you be having the usual tonight, sir?" the new server asked with practiced courtesy, his smile bright but somehow hollow. "Yes, thank you," Charles replied, but as the young man walked away, Charles felt an unexpected pang of loss. Maya would have already known his order. She would have noticed if he seemed tired, would have adjusted her service accordingly, might have made a gentle observation about the weather, or asked after his well-being with genuine interest rather than scripted politeness. The realization disturbed Charles more than he had anticipated. In the weeks leading up to Maya's departure, he had begun to see her not just as part of the restaurant's staffing, but as a person whose quiet competence and genuine warmth had enhanced his dining experience in ways he was only now beginning to understand. Her absence felt personal in a way that surprised him. Robert Chen approached his table with the deferential attention reserved for high-value customers, his expression carrying the careful neutrality of someone accustomed to managing wealthy patrons' needs and occasional complaints. "Mr. Montgomery, I hope James is providing satisfactory service this evening?" "He's fine," Charles replied, then hesitated before adding, "What happened to Maya?" Robert's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Maya is no longer with us. We had some customer service issues that needed to be addressed." "Customer service issues?" Charles had observed Maya's interactions with difficult customers for months, had witnessed her professionalism in the face of entitled behavior that would have challenged anyone's patience. She was one of your most experienced servers. Yes, well, experience doesn't always translate to customer satisfaction. We received multiple complaints about her service quality, and unfortunately, we had to make a business decision. The explanation felt hollow, like corporate speak, designed to obscure rather than illuminate truth. Charles had seen Maya handle difficult situations with grace and competence that exceeded what should reasonably be expected from restaurant staff. The idea that her service quality warranted termination struck him as not just incorrect, but actively unjust. What kind of complaints? Robert's discomfort became more visible. I'm not really at liberty to discuss specific personnel matters, Mr. Montgomery, but I can assure you that the decision wasn't made lightly. Charles nodded, but as Robert walked away, he felt a growing sense of unease about the justice of Maya's dismissal. He had witnessed enough of her interactions with customers to know that her service consistently exceeded professional standards. The complaints that had led to her termination seemed more likely to reflect the entitlement and casual cruelty of certain customers rather than any failing on Maya's part. Over the following days, Charles found himself thinking about Maya more than seemed appropriate for someone he had known only in the context of restaurant service, but their interactions had transcended the typical customer-server relationship. In her presence, he had felt seen in a way that had nothing to do with his wealth or social status. She had treated him with the same genuine courtesy she extended to all customers, recognizing his humanity rather than just his purchasing power. The contrast with his usual social circle was striking. Most of Charles's relationships were transactional in some way. Business partnerships, social obligations, romantic interests attracted to his portfolio rather than his character. Maya's unpretentious warmth had reminded him of what authentic human connection felt like, and her absence left him feeling oddly bereft. Charles began making inquiries, using the discreet network of connections that wealth provided. A few phone calls to restaurant industry contacts, a conversation with a friend who sat on charity boards with the wives of restaurant owners, and gradually, a clearer picture of Maya's situation emerged. The complaints against Maya had come from two customers known in Chicago's restaurant scene for their difficult behavior. Jennifer Wardwell and Mrs. Patterson both had reputations for treating service staff poorly, using restaurants as stages for displaying their social dominance through the humiliation of people who couldn't fight back. Their complaints against Maya followed familiar patterns, criticisms that had more to do with asserting power than addressing actual service failures. More disturbing was what Charles learned about Maya's personal circumstances. Through a connection at Northwestern University, he discovered that Maya Rodriguez had a son, Diego, who had been accepted to the engineering program with partial financial aid. The family's financial situation was precarious enough that Maya's job loss would likely make college attendance impossible, despite Diego's academic achievements. The injustice of the situation crystallized for Charles with uncomfortable clarity. A young man's educational future was being sacrificed to accommodate the petty cruelties of wealthy women who used their purchasing power as a weapon against working people. Maya, whose only crime had been maintaining her dignity while serving customers who treated her as invisible, was facing financial disaster because Azure valued the social media influence of difficult customers over the competence and humanity of their staff. For the first time in years, Charles felt moved to action by something other than financial opportunity or social obligation. The unfairness of Maya's situation awakened in him something that had been dormant since his wife's death, a sense of moral responsibility that extended beyond his own interests. Charles had built his fortune through a combination of inherited advantage, strategic intelligence, and the ruthless prioritization of profit over sentiment. His cryptocurrency investments alone had generated returns that fluctuated by amounts representing multiple years of Maya's salary. His real estate portfolio included properties that appreciated in value faster than most people earned income. His stock holdings in technology companies produced dividend payments that exceeded what Azure paid its servers in annual wages. The disparity between his wealth and Maya's economic vulnerability was so vast as to be almost abstract. But the human consequences of that disparity were now impossible for Charles to ignore. Maya's competence, dignity, and dedication to her work deserved better than termination at the whim of entitled customers. Her son's intelligence and academic achievement deserved the opportunity that financial circumstances threatened to make impossible. Charles had the resources to address these injustices, but more importantly, he was beginning to feel the moral obligation to do so. His wealth had insulated him from considering the human costs of economic inequality, but Maya's grace under pressure had awakened his conscience in ways he hadn't expected. What Charles decided to do next would surprise everyone who knew him, including himself. It would require him to act not as a wealthy customer preserving his comfort, but as a human being, recognizing the worth of another person whose value couldn't be measured by market forces or social status. The silence that had followed Maya's departure was about to be broken by an act of justice that would transform both their lives, proving that sometimes the most profound changes begin not with grand gestures, but with the simple recognition that human dignity transcends economic circumstances. Charles Montgomery had never considered himself an impulsive man, but what he did next came from a place deeper than calculation or strategy. It came from the recognition that privilege carried responsibilities he had spent too many years ignoring. The revelation came on a Thursday morning, exactly 1 week after Maya's termination, when Charles was reviewing his quarterly financial statements in his lakefront office. The numbers were impressive even by his standards. His cryptocurrency portfolio had gained $12 million in value over the past 3 months. His real estate investments were generating returns that exceeded his most optimistic projections, and his stock market holdings continued their steady climb toward what his financial advisors described as generational wealth. But as Charles studied these abstractions of success, he found himself thinking about more concrete realities. Maya's final paycheck from Azure would have been perhaps $800, covering 2 weeks of work that required far more skill and emotional labor than most people recognized. Diego's college expenses, tuition, room, board, books, living expenses, represented a financial obstacle that could derail a young man's future despite his academic achievements. Charles had earned more money in the past quarter than Maya would see in a decade of perfect performance at Azure, and he had done so without leaving his office, without serving a single customer, without enduring casual humiliation or job insecurity. The disparity felt not just mathematically absurd, but morally indefensible. But Charles Montgomery was a wealthy man in Chicago, heir to connections and resources that money alone couldn't purchase. Finding Maya Rodriguez required nothing more than a single phone call to a private investigation firm that specialized in discreet inquiries for Chicago's elite. What he learned about her current situation motivated him to act with uncharacteristic urgency. Maya and Diego lived in a modest 2-bedroom apartment in Pilsen, renting month to month from a landlord who had recently raised their rent beyond what Maya's unemployment benefits could sustain. She had been applying for restaurant jobs throughout the city, but her termination from Azure, however unjust, was creating complications in her search for comparable employment. References from high-end establishments carried weight in Chicago's restaurant industry, and losing a position at Azure suggested problems that prospective employers were reluctant to inherit. Diego was working full-time at an auto repair shop, having graduated from high school 2 weeks earlier, with honors that should have guaranteed him opportunities for advancement. Instead, he was trying to save enough money to defer his enrollment at Northwestern for a year, hoping that 12 months of full-time work might generate sufficient resources to make college financially viable. The mathematics of their situation were brutal. Maya's unemployment benefits provided barely enough for rent and basic expenses, leaving no margin for the unexpected costs that seemed to multiply when financial resources were scarce. Diego's wages from the auto shop, while respectable for an 18-year-old, were insufficient to cover college costs that had been calculated, assuming Maya's continued employment at Azure. Charles read the investigator's report twice, feeling a growing anger at the systemic injustices that made Maya's competence and dedication irrelevant to her economic security. She had been punished for the entitlement of customers who used their wealth as a weapon against working people. And now her son was facing the collapse of educational dreams because Charles's social class treated restaurant servers as expendable conveniences rather than people deserving of dignity and job security. But anger, Charles realized, was less useful than action. He had resources that could address Maya's situation directly, and more importantly, he had begun to understand that his wealth carried moral obligations he had spent too many years avoiding. What Charles did next was unprecedented in his usually cautious approach to personal involvement in other people's problems. He drove to Pilsen on a Saturday afternoon, parking his Tesla in front of a small apartment building that housed the kind of working families he had somehow managed to never really see, despite living in the same city his entire adult life. Maya answered the door wearing jeans and a Northwestern University t-shirt that she had bought for Diego before learning about his acceptance, back when college seemed like an approaching celebration rather than an impossible dream. Her expression reflected the caution of someone who had learned that unexpected visitors usually brought complicated news. "Mr. Montgomery." Maya's voice carried surprise but not alarm, though Charles could see her calculating the implications of his presence in her neighborhood, at her home, on a weekend afternoon when no business relationship existed to explain the visit. "Hello, Maya. I hope you don't mind me stopping by. I wanted to speak with you about something important." Maya stepped aside to let him enter, and Charles found himself in a living space that was smaller than his walk-in closet, but somehow warmer and more welcoming than any room in his lakefront penthouse. The apartment smelled faintly of coffee and the kind of cooking that comes from making inexpensive ingredients into something nourishing and satisfying. Photographs of Diego covered one wall, graduation, various school events, moments of achievement preserved with the careful attention of a mother who documented her son's success as proof of possibility. Diego emerged from what Charles assumed was his bedroom, extending a hand with the kind of confident respect that suggested Maya had raised him to treat all people with dignity regardless of their economic circumstances. He was tall like his mother, with intelligent eyes and the calloused hands of someone accustomed to physical work. "This is my son, Diego," Maya said, and Charles could hear the pride in her voice that no amount of financial stress had been able to diminish. "Diego, this is Mr. Montgomery. He was a regular customer at Azure." "Nice to meet you, sir," Diego said, and Charles was struck by the young man's poise and maturity, qualities that had been developed despite economic circumstances that would have challenged many adults. "Diego, I understand you've been accepted to Northwestern for engineering?" "Yes, sir, though I'm planning to defer for a year, maybe work and save some money first." The casual way Diego discussed postponing his education hit Charles harder than he had expected. This young man possessed exactly the kind of intelligence and work ethic that deserved encouragement and opportunity, yet he was preparing to sacrifice his academic future because of economic circumstances beyond his control. "Maya," Charles said, turning back to her, "I came here because what happened at Azure was unjust. You were terminated not because of your performance, which was exemplary, but because of customers who used their economic power to abuse someone who couldn't fight back. I've seen you work. I know the quality of service you provided. Your termination was wrong, and the consequences for you and Diego are unacceptable." Maya's expression shifted through confusion, wariness, and something that might have been hope before settling into the careful neutrality she had learned to maintain when dealing with wealthy people whose motives were unclear. Mr. Montgomery, I appreciate your concern, but I don't understand why you're here or what you're suggesting. Charles had rehearsed this conversation during the drive to Pilsen, but facing Maya in her modest living room, surrounded by evidence of the life she had built through determination and sacrifice, his prepared remarks felt inadequate to address the magnitude of what he was about to propose. I'm here because I want to offer you a position, not as a server, but as my personal assistant and household manager. The salary would be $90,000 annually with full health benefits. And I would additionally establish an educational fund for Diego that would cover his complete college expenses at Northwestern, including tuition, room, board, and living expenses. The offer hung in the air like something too substantial to be real. Maya stared at Charles with the expression of someone trying to process information that seemed to violate the basic rules of how life worked for people in her economic circumstances. Diego's eyes widened, and he looked between his mother and Charles with the kind of hope that young people feel before experience teaches them that dreams usually cost more than families can afford. I don't understand, Maya said finally. You don't know me beyond customer service interactions. Why would you make such an offer? Because, Charles replied, I've spent too many years pretending that wealth doesn't carry moral obligations. You deserve better than what happened at Azure. Diego deserves the opportunity to develop his talents without financial barriers. I have resources that can address these problems easily, and ignoring that capacity would make me complicit in an injustice I have the power to correct. It was the most honest explanation Charles had ever given for any decision involving his money, and speaking the words aloud felt like the first genuine thing he had said about wealth and responsibility in years. But Maya's response would prove that dignity and independence couldn't be purchased, even with offers that seemed to solve every practical problem, and that true respect sometimes required understanding the difference between charity and justice. Maya Rodriguez stood in her modest living room, looking at Charles Montgomery with the careful expression of someone who had learned to be suspicious of offers that seemed too good to be true. In her experience, wealthy people didn't drive to Pilsen on Saturday afternoons to hand out $90,000 jobs to unemployed waitresses, and the disparity between the offer and her current circumstances felt so vast as to suggest complications she couldn't yet identify. Mr. Montgomery, Maya said carefully, her voice carrying the diplomatic tone she had perfected during 3 years of managing difficult customers. I'm grateful for your concern about my situation, but I need to understand what you're really proposing. Personal assistant positions that pay $90,000 usually require qualifications I don't possess. Diego watched the conversation with the intensity of someone whose future hung in the balance, but Charles noticed that the young man seemed to inherit his mother's wariness along with her dignity. Neither of them appeared ready to accept unusual generosity without understanding its true cost. The qualifications you possess, Charles replied, are more valuable than most credentials. You've demonstrated intelligence, integrity, professionalism under pressure, and the kind of emotional intelligence that can't be taught in graduate programs. My household and business affairs require someone I can trust completely, someone who understands service without sacrificing self-respect. Maya absorbed this explanation while studying Charles's face for the subtle signs of deception or hidden agenda that her years in restaurants had taught her to recognize. But what she saw instead was something she hadn't expected from someone of his wealth and social status, genuine respect for her competence and character. And Diego's education? Would be handled through an educational trust that I would establish immediately. Full tuition, room, board, books, and living expenses for 4 years, with graduate school funding available if his academic performance justifies advanced study. The offer represented more money than Maya had ever imagined having access to, financial security that would transform both their lives in ways that felt almost fantastical. But her response revealed the complex relationship between pride and necessity that governed the lives of working people who maintained their dignity despite economic vulnerability. Mr. Montgomery, what you're describing sounds like charity disguised as employment. I've worked hard all my life, and I've never accepted handouts, even when times were difficult. Charles felt a surge of respect for Maya's response. She was facing financial catastrophe. Her son's educational future was in jeopardy, and yet her first concern was maintaining the independence and self-respect that defined her character. It was exactly the kind of response he should have anticipated from someone who had maintained such dignity while serving entitled customers at Azure. Maya, this isn't charity. It's recognition of value that has been systematically undercompensated. The service industry exploits people like you by paying wages that don't reflect the skill, emotional labor, and professionalism your work requires. What I'm offering is closer to what your competence has always deserved. Diego stepped forward, his expression reflecting the kind of mature consideration that suggested Maya had raised him to think carefully about significant decisions. Mom, maybe we should consider this. I mean, if Mr. Montgomery is offering real employment, Diego, Maya's voice carried gentle firmness, we don't make decisions about our future based on offers we don't fully understand. Mr. Montgomery, may I ask what prompted this? Because people with your resources don't usually concern themselves with the employment problems of former restaurant servers. The directness of Maya's question forced Charles to confront the complexity of his own motivations. Was he acting from genuine concern for justice, from guilt about his class's treatment of working people, from loneliness that Maya's warmth had temporarily relieved, or from some combination of factors he wasn't entirely ready to examine? Maya, watching what happened to you at Azure made me realize how completely I had disconnected from the human consequences of economic inequality. I have wealth that fluctuates by millions of dollars based on market movements I don't control, while you lost your job because customers used their spending power to humiliate someone who couldn't defend herself. That disparity isn't just mathematically absurd, it's morally indefensible. Charles paused, looking around the apartment that represented everything Maya and Diego had built together through determination and mutual support. But beyond the abstract injustice, I've come to respect you as a person. Your professionalism, your grace under pressure, the way you treated difficult customers with dignity they didn't deserve. Those qualities are exactly what I need in someone I can trust with the details of my life and business. Maya studied Charles's expression with the careful attention of someone assessing the sincerity of motivations that would determine her family's future. What she saw was something unexpected: vulnerability beneath wealth, loneliness that money hadn't addressed, and what appeared to be genuine recognition of her value as a person rather than just a potential employee. Can I have some time to consider your offer? Of course. Take whatever time you need. But Maya, I want you to know that Diego's educational funding isn't conditional on your employment decision. Regardless of whether you choose to work for me, are establishing the trust for his college expenses, that's not negotiable. It's what justice requires. The statement hit Maya like a physical force. Diego's eyes filled with tears he was too proud to let fall, and Maya felt something crack open in her chest, the wall she had built around hope to protect herself from disappointment. Mr. Montgomery, call me Charles, and Maya, I know this seems overwhelming, but sometimes justice looks like unexpected opportunities. You've earned this 1,000 times over through work that has been consistently undervalued. Let me do something right with money that has mostly insulated me from considering what's right. After Charles left, Maya and Diego sat in their living room, surrounded by the same modest furniture and family photographs. But everything felt different. The possibilities that had seemed foreclosed by financial reality were suddenly open again, dependent only on Maya's willingness to trust someone whose motivations she was still trying to understand. Mom, Diego said quietly, I think he means it. Maya nodded, but her expression remained thoughtful. The question isn't whether he means it, mijo. The question is whether we can accept it without losing something essential about who we are. It was a conversation that would continue that evening and into the following days as Maya weighed the practical benefits of Charles's offer against her need to maintain the independence and self-respect that had carried her through years of economic struggle. But already, something fundamental had shifted in both their lives, the recognition that sometimes justice arrives in forms too surprising to anticipate, delivered by people whose own transformations are just beginning. Maya's decision would prove that dignity couldn't be purchased, but that it could be recognized and honored by people willing to see beyond the barriers that wealth and social status typically created. And Charles's offer would begin his own journey back toward the kind of person his late wife had fallen in love with, before grief and money had built walls around his capacity for genuine human connection. The reunion, when it came, would prove that some transformations benefit everyone involved, and that the most profound changes often begin with the simple recognition that human worth transcends economic circumstances. 3 weeks after Charles's visit to Pilsen, Maya Rodriguez walked into the lobby of Montgomery Holdings, located on the 52nd floor of a downtown Chicago high-rise that offered views of both Lake Michigan and the sprawling neighborhoods where the city's working families lived, their lives mostly invisible to the executives who made decisions in glass towers. Maya had spent those 3 weeks thinking, researching, and asking questions that helped her understand both the opportunity Charles was offering and the man making the offer. She had learned that Charles Montgomery's business reputation was built on intelligence, integrity, and the kind of strategic thinking that had transformed inherited wealth into a financial empire. More importantly, she had discovered that his wife, Elizabeth, had worked with educational nonprofits before her death 3 years earlier, suggesting that his concern for Diego's college funding might reflect values that predated their meeting at Azure. But what had ultimately convinced Maya to accept Charles's offer wasn't the financial security or even Diego's educational opportunities. It was the recognition that Charles seemed to see her as a person whose competence and character deserved respect, rather than as a charity case requiring rescue. He was offering employment, not salvation, and the distinction mattered to someone whose pride had sustained her through years of economic struggle. Charles's office occupied a corner of the 52nd floor, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of the city that stretched from the Gold Coast to neighborhoods like Pilsen, where Maya had built her life through determination and sacrifice. The space was elegant, but not ostentatious, furnished with pieces that suggested good taste rather than conspicuous consumption. Maya, Charles stood as she entered, extending his hand with the kind of genuine warmth she had glimpsed during his visits to Azure, but never fully experienced. "Thank you for coming. I hope the security and elevator process wasn't too complicated." "It was fine," Maya replied, though she didn't mention the intimidation she had felt walking through the marble and glass lobby, past security guards and reception desks that screamed exclusive access and serious money. "Thank you for waiting while I considered your offer." "Of course. This is a significant decision for you and Diego. I'm pleased you decided to give this opportunity a chance." Maya had dressed carefully for this meeting, choosing professional attire that reflected her seriousness about the position while staying true to her own sense of style. She looked around Charles's office, noting the books on economics and urban development, photographs from what appeared to be charity events, and a framed picture of a woman she assumed was Elizabeth Montgomery. "Before I officially accept," Maya said, "I need to understand exactly what you expect from a personal assistant and household manager. I want to be certain I can perform this job excellently, not just adequately." Charles smiled, recognizing in Maya's question the same attention to quality that had made her such an exceptional server at Azure. "The role involves coordinating my calendar, managing correspondence, overseeing my household staff, organizing travel arrangements, and handling various business-related administrative tasks. But more than specific duties, I need someone I can trust completely, someone who can anticipate needs and solve problems with the kind of intelligence and discretion you demonstrated every night at Azure. And the salary you mentioned? $90,000 annually, plus full health benefits. 2 weeks paid vacation to start with additional time off as needed for Diego's school events or family circumstances, and performance bonuses based on the value you add to my business efficiency. Maya absorbed the details, comparing them to wages she had earned serving tables where single bottles of wine cost more than her daily tips. The contrast felt surreal, but Charles's matter-of-fact presentation helped normalize what still felt like an extraordinary opportunity. What about Diego's education funding? Charles opened a folder on his desk, removing documents that looked official and permanent. I've established the education trust as promised. Full tuition, room, board, books, and living expenses at Northwestern, with additional funding available for graduate school if his academic performance justifies advanced study. The trust is irrevocable and independent of your employment. Even if you decide to leave this position, Diego's college funding is secure. The permanence of the arrangement hit Maya harder than she had expected. For 18 years, she had carried sole responsibility for Diego's future, making countless sacrifices to ensure his opportunities weren't limited by their economic circumstances. Now, with the signing of legal documents, that burden was lifted, replaced by the certainty that her son's intelligence and work ethic could determine his future rather than their financial limitations. Mr. Montgomery, Charles, Maya corrected herself. I need you to understand something. I've never accepted charity, and I won't start now. If I take this position, I'll earn every dollar through competent work that adds genuine value to your business and personal affairs. I don't want to be your good deed. I want to be your excellent employee. Charles felt a surge of respect for Maya's response, recognizing in her words the integrity and self-respect that had attracted him to her character in the first place. Maya, I understand completely. And I want you to know that I'm not offering this position out of sympathetic guilt. I need someone with your skills, and I've seen enough of your work to know that you'll exceed my requirements. Maya nodded, studying Charles's expression for any sign of condescension or false assurance. What she saw instead was recognition, the acknowledgement of competence between professionals who respected each other's abilities. Then I accept. They shook hands, and Maya felt something settle in her chest that she hadn't experienced in years. Security. Not just financial security, though that was profound, but the security of being valued for her intelligence and character, rather than merely tolerated as a service provider. Charles showed Maya around the office, introducing her to staff members and explaining systems she would need to understand. He treated her not as a former waitress being rescued from unemployment, but as a new team member whose contributions would be essential to the organization's continued success. As they discussed the practical details of Maya's new role, Charles mentioned that Diego would be entering Northwestern in the fall semester, just 6 weeks away. The trust fund was already established, tuition was paid, and dormitory arrangements had been made through the university's financial aid office. I can't adequately express what this means to my family, Maya said as they concluded their meeting. Maya, excellent people deserve excellent opportunities. What happened at Azure was an injustice, but sometimes justice arrives in unexpected forms. I'm grateful that I can be part of correcting that situation. As Maya left Montgomery Holdings that afternoon, taking the elevator down from the 52nd floor toward the streets where she had built her life through determination and hope, she felt the strange sensation of a dream becoming reality through forces she had never imagined possible. But the most profound transformation was still ahead. Maya's competence and integrity would prove invaluable to Charles's business operations, while her warmth and authentic concern for others would help him rediscover parts of himself that had been buried under grief and the isolation that extreme wealth often created. Their working relationship would evolve into something neither had anticipated, a friendship based on mutual respect and recognition of each other's essential humanity, proving that sometimes the most meaningful connections form across the artificial barriers that society constructs between different economic classes. Maya Rodriguez was about to discover that justice, when it finally arrives, often comes in the form of people who recognize value that others have been blind to see. 6 months after Maya began working as Charles Montgomery's personal assistant, she stood in the elegant kitchen of his lakefront penthouse, coordinating a charity fundraiser that would raise over $200,000 for educational scholarships serving students from working-class families throughout Chicago. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was now organizing events for the same social class that had once treated her as invisible, but from a position of respect and authority that transformed her relationship to wealth and power. Maya had proven herself exceptional in her new role, applying the same attention to detail and anticipation of needs that had made her an outstanding server, but now in an environment where those skills were recognized and valued appropriately. She managed Charles's complex schedule with efficiency that impressed his business associates, coordinated household staff with the diplomatic skills of someone who understood both leadership and service, and handled confidential business correspondence with discretion that made her invaluable to Charles's various enterprises. But more than professional competence, Maya had brought something to Charles's life that money couldn't purchase: genuine human connection. Her warmth and authentic concern for others had begun to thaw the isolation he had built around himself since Elizabeth's death. Through Maya's influence, Charles found himself reconnecting with charitable work that Elizabeth had been passionate about, using his wealth in ways that created opportunity rather than merely accumulating more assets. Diego was thriving at Northwestern, his natural intelligence flourishing in an academic environment that challenged and supported his development as an engineer. He called Maya every Sunday evening, sharing stories about his classes, his friends, and the research opportunities that were already opening doors to his future. Maya would listen with the quiet satisfaction of a mother whose sacrifices had been redeemed, whose son's dreams were becoming reality through his own efforts supported by resources she had never imagined they would access. Tonight's charity event represented something unprecedented in Charles's social history. A gathering designed not to display wealth, but to direct it toward addressing educational inequality. Maya had suggested the focus, drawing on her own experience of financial barriers to academic opportunity, and Charles had embraced the idea with enthusiasm that surprised his usual social circle. The guest list included Chicago's elite, but also educators, community leaders, and scholarship recipients whose presence would ensure that the evening's purpose remained centered on impact rather than social display. Maya had insisted on this diverse attendance, arguing that effective charity required understanding the people and communities being served rather than just writing checks from a comfortable distance. As guests arrived at Charles's penthouse, Maya moved through the gathering with confidence that represented a complete transformation from her days at Azure. She was no longer serving wealthy people while hoping to remain invisible. She was coordinating an event where her intelligence and organizational skills were essential to its success, interacting with Chicago's most influential citizens as a respected professional rather than hired help. Maya, Charles approached her near the expansive windows overlooking Lake Michigan. I wanted you to know that Senator Williams just commented on how beautifully organized this evening is. She said it's the most meaningful charity event she's attended in years. Maya smiled, feeling the satisfaction of work well done and appropriately recognized. Thank you, Charles. I think the diverse attendance is making a difference. When scholarship recipients can share their stories directly with potential donors, it creates connections that go beyond financial transactions. Charles nodded, recognizing the wisdom in Maya's approach. She had taught him that effective philanthropy required more than generous giving. It demanded genuine engagement with the communities being served, understanding that moved beyond sympathy to encompass respect and partnership. Charles Montgomery? A voice interrupted their conversation, and Maya turned to see a woman approaching with the kind of predatory smile that suggested complicated social dynamics were about to unfold. Maya recognized her immediately, though it took a moment to place her outside the context of Azure's dining room. Jennifer Wardwell, the customer whose complaints had contributed to Maya's termination, stood before them wearing an expensive dress and the confident expression of someone accustomed to being the center of attention at social gatherings. "Jennifer," Charles replied with polite coolness, "I'm pleased you could attend tonight." Jennifer's eyes moved to Maya, and for a moment her expression reflected confusion as she tried to place the familiar face in this unexpected context. When recognition finally dawned, her smile faltered, replaced by something between embarrassment and defensiveness. "I'm sorry, but don't I know you from somewhere?" Maya felt the familiar tension that had once accompanied interactions with difficult customers, but now the power dynamic was completely different. She was no longer a server who had to absorb abuse with professional grace. She was Charles's trusted assistant at an event she had organized, surrounded by people who respected her competence and valued her contributions. "Yes," Maya replied with calm dignity. "I used to work at Azure. I served your table several times." Jennifer's face flushed as the implications of the situation became clear. The server she had publicly humiliated, whose competence she had disparaged, whose job she had helped destroy through her complaints, now stood before her as an equal in Chicago's elite social circles, clearly trusted and respected by one of the city's most influential businessmen. I had no idea you were working with Charles now," Jennifer stammered, her usual social confidence deserting her in the face of this reversed power dynamic. "Maya is my personal assistant and event coordinator," Charles said smoothly, his voice carrying subtle emphasis that made clear his respect for Maya's position. "She organized this entire evening. Her intelligence and attention to detail have been invaluable to my business operations." The vindication was more complete than Maya could have imagined months earlier when she had cleared out her locker at Azure. Jennifer Wardwell, whose entitled behavior had contributed to Maya's termination, now found herself in the uncomfortable position of having to acknowledge Maya's competence and success, surrounded by witnesses who had seen Maya's professional excellence throughout the evening. But Maya's response revealed the grace that had sustained her through years of service work and economic struggle. Instead of enjoying Jennifer's discomfort or highlighting the injustice of her previous treatment, Maya chose dignity over revenge. "It's good to see you again, Mrs. Wardwell," Maya said simply. "I hope you're enjoying this evening's program. The scholarship recipients have some truly inspiring stories to share." The conversation moved forward with professional courtesy, but the moment had crystallized something important for everyone involved. Jennifer was forced to confront the consequences of her past behavior, recognizing that the server she had dismissed and demeaned possessed intelligence and competence that far exceeded her own contributions to society. Charles witnessed Maya's character revealed in her response to someone who had treated her unjustly, seeing grace that validated every decision he had made about her worth and potential. And Maya experienced the profound satisfaction of redemption, not through revenge or confrontation, but through the simple demonstration that her value had never been diminished by other people's failure to recognize it. As the evening concluded and guests departed with commitments that would generate significant scholarship funding for students facing the same financial barriers that had once threatened Diego's education, Maya and Charles stood together looking out at the Chicago skyline, the city lights reflecting their own transformation over the past months. "Maya," Charles said quietly, "I want you to know that hiring you was the best decision I've made in years, not just professionally, but personally. You've helped me remember who I wanted to be." Maya smiled, thinking about Diego sleeping in his dormitory at Northwestern, pursuing dreams that were now sustainable through his own intelligence and Charles's recognition of justice. "Thank you, Charles, for seeing something in me that I had almost forgotten was there." The redemption was complete, but more importantly, It had created the foundation for continued growth and opportunity that would benefit everyone involved. Maya had proven that competence and character transcended economic circumstances, while Charles had discovered that wealth carried its greatest meaning when used to recognize and develop human potential that had been systematically undervalued. But the most profound transformation was still unfolding. Two people from different worlds had found in each other the recognition and respect that made both their lives richer in ways that had nothing to do with money, and everything to do with recovering their essential humanity through the simple act of seeing each other clearly. Tonight, under the dim glow of chandeliers that once cast shadows of hierarchy and service, Maya Rodriguez had stood beside Charles Montgomery as his equal, his respected colleague, his friend. The waitress who had been dismissed for the convenience of entitled customers had become a woman whose intelligence and grace enhanced the lives of everyone fortunate enough to recognize her true worth. And Charles Montgomery, the wealthy man who had once sat in comfortable isolation while servers moved like shadows around his table, had discovered that the most valuable things in life couldn't be purchased. They could only be recognized, nurtured, and honored through the kind of justice that sometimes arrives wearing the unexpected face of human decency. 2 years later, Maya Rodriguez stood before a mirror in her new apartment in Lincoln Park, adjusting the collar of a dress she had purchased for an evening that represented the complete transformation of her life's trajectory. Tonight, she would be honored at the Chicago Foundation for Educational Excellence's annual gala, receiving an award for her work establishing scholarship programs that had already provided college funding for over 50 students from working-class families throughout the city. Diego, now a junior at Northwestern with internship offers from 3 major engineering firms, would introduce her at the ceremony. Maya's brother, who had flown in from Phoenix for the occasion, would watch from the audience as his sister received recognition for achievements that transcended anything their family had imagined possible during her years waiting tables at Azure. But the most profound change wasn't in Maya's external circumstances, though those improvements were undeniable. She now lived comfortably, her work was intellectually challenging and properly compensated, and her son's future was secured through his own academic excellence, supported by resources that removed financial barriers to his aspirations. The deeper transformation was in Maya's relationship with her own worth, the understanding that her competence, intelligence, and character had always deserved recognition and opportunity, regardless of the economic circumstances that had temporarily obscured their value. Charles Montgomery would also be honored tonight, receiving an award for philanthropic innovation that had directed millions of dollars toward educational access and opportunity. But Charles knew that his charitable work had been transformed by Maya's influence. Her insistence that effective philanthropy required genuine engagement with the communities being served rather than charitable distance maintained through financial contributions alone. Their working relationship had evolved into something neither had anticipated when Charles first visited Maya's apartment in Pilsen with an offer that had seemed too generous to be real. Maya had proven herself invaluable, not just as an assistant, but as an advisor whose insights into educational inequality, social justice, and community engagement had enhanced Charles's business decisions and philanthropic strategies. Her competence had exceeded his highest expectations, but more importantly, her integrity and authentic concern for others had influenced his own development as a person who used wealth responsibly rather than merely accumulating it successfully. Charles's charitable foundation now focused primarily on educational access, establishing vocational training programs, college preparation courses, and scholarship funds that addressed the systematic barriers that prevented talented students from developing their potential. Maya served on the foundation's board of directors, her experience with economic struggle providing essential perspective on the design and implementation of programs intended to create opportunity rather than merely provide temporary assistance. But tonight's ceremony represented more than personal achievement or even successful philanthropy. It marked the recognition of a principle that Maya and Charles had proven together, that human worth transcends economic circumstances, that competence and character deserve recognition regardless of the social class or employment status in which they're initially observed, and that justice sometimes arrives through the simple willingness of people to see beyond the barriers that wealth and poverty create between human beings. As Maya walked through the ballroom where Chicago's elite had gathered to celebrate educational philanthropy, she moved with confidence and grace that reflected not just her current success, but her essential dignity that had sustained her through years when that dignity was unrecognized and undervalued. She was no longer serving this social class from a position of economic vulnerability. She was participating as their equal, her intelligence and contributions essential to the evening's purpose. Maya, a familiar voice called her name, and she turned to see Robert Chen, the maitre d' from Azure, approaching with an expression that mixed surprise with something that might have been regret. Maya had not seen Robert since the afternoon he had terminated her employment, and his presence at tonight's event suggested connections between Chicago's restaurant industry and its philanthropic community that she had never previously considered. "Robert," Maya replied with the professional courtesy she had maintained throughout their difficult final interaction at Azure, "it's good to see you." Robert's discomfort was visible as he processed the complete reversal of their previous dynamic. The server he had been forced to terminate for the convenience of difficult customers now stood before him wearing an elegant dress, surrounded by Chicago's most influential citizens, about to be honored for work that had generated millions of dollars in educational funding. "Maya, I've followed your work with the Montgomery Foundation. The scholarship programs you've developed have been remarkable." Maya studied Robert's expression, recognizing in it the same calculations she had once seen when he weighed her job security against customer satisfaction metrics. But now the mathematics were different. Maya possessed social influence and professional recognition that made her opinion matter in ways that her competence as a server never had. "Thank you, Robert. It's been rewarding work." "Maya, I want you to know that terminating your employment at Azure was one of the most difficult decisions I've had to make as a manager. You were exceptional at your job, and losing you was a genuine loss for the restaurant." The apology, delivered 2 years too late, reflected Robert's recognition that Maya's subsequent success had retroactively revealed the injustice of her treatment at Azure. But Maya's response demonstrated the character development that had accompanied her changed circumstances. "I understand the position you were in, Robert. Customer satisfaction drives restaurant profitability, and difficult customers can damage a business's reputation regardless of whether their complaints are justified. I don't hold personal animosity toward you for making what you felt was a necessary business decision." Robert looked surprised by Maya's gracious response, having perhaps expected anger or vindictiveness that would have been understandable given the circumstances of her termination. "But," Maya continued, "I hope my experience at Azure demonstrated that competent servers deserve better protection against customers who use their economic power to abuse people who can't defend themselves. The restaurant industry would benefit from policies that support staff integrity rather than automatically prioritizing customer complaints regardless of their validity." It was a mature, systemic analysis that addressed the broader injustices that had cost Maya her job while avoiding personal attacks on Robert's character or decision-making. Maya had learned that effective change came through institutional reform rather than individual blame, and her response reflected the kind of strategic thinking that had made her valuable to Charles's business operations. Charles approached them as their conversation was concluding, extending his hand to Robert with polite recognition. "Robert, good to see you here tonight. Are you familiar with Maya's work establishing educational access programs?" "I'm learning about it," Robert replied, glancing between Charles and Maya with an expression that suggested he was still processing the implications of their partnership and Maya's subsequent success. Maya's insights into educational barriers facing working-class families have been invaluable, Charles continued. Her experience and intelligence have transformed our foundation's approach to scholarship programming. We're funding students who might never have accessed higher education without the programs Maya designed. The conversation concluded with professional courtesy, but as Robert walked away, Maya felt the profound satisfaction of vindication, not through personal revenge, but through demonstrated competence that had created opportunities for other people facing the same barriers she had once confronted. "Are you ready for tonight's ceremony?" Charles asked, and Maya smiled with confidence that reflected her complete transformation from the unemployed waitress he had visited in Pilsen 2 years earlier. "I'm ready," Maya replied, and the simple statement carried weight that encompassed not just tonight's recognition, but her entire journey toward understanding and claiming her own worth. As the evening's program began, and Maya prepared to accept an award for work that had grown from her own experience with economic injustice, she thought about all the servers, cooks, cleaning staff, and other service workers whose competence and dignity remained unrecognized, whose intelligence was ignored because of the social positions they occupied out of economic necessity rather than personal choice. Maya Rodriguez had proven that human worth transcends economic circumstances, but more importantly, she had used her transformation to create opportunities for other people whose potential might otherwise remain invisible to those with the power to recognize and develop it. Tonight's ceremony was not the end of her story, but rather the beginning of a larger mission, ensuring that competence, character, and human dignity could be recognized and honored regardless of the economic circumstances in which they were encountered. And if someone in tonight's audience, perhaps a server, a cook, a housekeeper, or any other working person whose dreams had been deferred by financial barriers, could see in Maya's journey proof that their own worth deserved recognition and opportunity, then the evening's true purpose would be fulfilled. Maya Rodriguez had learned that justice sometimes arrives wearing unexpected faces, delivered by people willing to see beyond the artificial barriers that separate human beings into categories of served and server, worthy and invisible, deserving and expendable. But the most profound lesson was that dignity, once recognized and honored, creates ripples of opportunity that extend far beyond individual transformation, touching the lives of everyone fortunate enough to encounter authentic human worth when it is finally allowed to flourish. And you, have you ever served others while your own dreams waited patiently in the background? Have you ever felt invisible while creating comfort for people who barely saw you as human? Have you carried competence and dignity through work that was essential but undervalued, hoping someone might recognize the person behind the professional smile? Maya Rodriguez's story reminds us that worth isn't determined by economic circumstances, that intelligence and character deserve recognition regardless of where they're discovered, and that sometimes justice arrives through people brave enough to see beyond the barriers that separate us into artificial categories of value and invisibility. If Maya's journey touched something in your heart, if you recognized yourself in her quiet strength or her refusal to let mistreatment diminish her dignity, please leave a like and subscribe so her story can reach another person who needs to remember that their worth has never been diminished by other people's failure to see it. Share this story with someone who serves others, in restaurants, hotels, shops, or any place where human dignity should be honored but isn't always recognized. Let them know that competence and character create their own rewards, even when those rewards take time to arrive. For more stories that honor the strength of working people and the unexpected ways justice finds us, click the link to our podcast on the left. Thank you for walking this emotional journey with us, for seeing the dignity and work that others take for granted, and for believing that every person's story matters. Maya's transformation began with one person willing to truly see her, but it continues with all of us who recognize that authentic worth transcends economic circumstances, and that the most meaningful changes happen when we honor the humanity in everyone we encounter. See you in our next story, where we'll explore another journey of recognition, justice, and the unexpected ways people discover their true value in a world that too often measures worth by wealth rather than character.